The gavel came down at $11, then $40, then $65, and stopped there. October 14th, 1974. Port Ellsworth, Penobscot County, Maine. 41 degrees, wind off the water, a crowd of maybe 30 people standing in the gravel lot behind the old customs house. Most of them there for the boat motors and the crated hardware, not for a scarred oak cabinet nobody could open. Roland Vance laughed first. He always did. $65 for a busted file cabinet, he said, loud enough for the auctioneer to hear it over the rest of the crowd. Otto's finally lost his mind. Otto Reyes did not answer him. He did not so much as turn his head. He signed a slip, counted out 3 20s and a 5 from a coin purse worn soft at the seams. The leather cracked along the fold from 30 years in his coat pocket, and waited for 2 men to load the cabinet onto his truck. The cabinet stood 5 feet tall, oak on the color of weak coffee, brass fittings green with age and cold to the touch. Someone had painted a government seal on the top drawer, and someone else had scraped most of it off with a knife, deep enough to gouge the wood underneath. Otto ran his thumb along the seam where the back panel met the frame. It did not sit flush. Nobody else in that lot had noticed, or if they had, nobody had thought it worth $65 to find out why. Otto had spent 40 years with his hands on wood, and wood that does not sit flush is wood hiding something. Otto Reyes was 68 years old, 5'9", built narrow through the shoulders the way men get when they have done close work their whole lives instead of heavy work. His hands were the story. Knuckles swollen with arthritis, 2 fingers on the left that no longer straightened all the way, a permanent groove worn into the pad of his thumb from 40 years of a chisel handle. He wore the same canvas coat he had worn for a decade, patched twice at the elbow, and steel-frame glasses that he pushed up his nose without thinking, over and over. He had run Blackwood Furniture Repair on Water Street since 1951. 23 years fixing what other people threw out. He learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from a man in Bangor who apprenticed under a cabinet maker trained in Quebec, and Otto still used some of his father's chisels, the handles worn down to fit no hand but his own. His father had taught him on a bench in a barn outside Bucksport. No heat in the winter months, and the first thing the old man ever told him was that a joint either holds or it doesn't, and there's no use dressing up a lie with varnish. Otto kept that. He never sold a repair he didn't trust, even when a customer would have paid double for less work. The work had thinned out. Furniture came from factories now, glued instead of joined, and people threw out what broke instead of paying a man like Otto to open it up and find out why. Younger men in town called it a dying trade, said it to his face sometimes, not unkindly. Otto kept the shop anyway. His wife had asked him once why he still went in every morning at 6, cold hands and all, arthritis, so bad some mornings he could not close a fist until the second cup of coffee, and he told her the only thing he knew how to say back. A cabinet does not fail all at once. It fails one hinge, one joint, one hidden panel at a time. Somebody has to be paying attention when it finally gives. He said nothing else about it. He never had to. Roland Vance was the senior customs officer for the district, 44 years old, 6'2", and he dressed like a man twice his salary. Pressed navy uniform, brass buttons shined that morning, black shoes without a scuff on them. A gold watch his wife had given him for a 15th anniversary that he checked more than he needed to. He drove a new Ford Galaxy, red, and he parked it where everyone at the auction would walk past it on their way to the tables. He inspected freight for a living, mostly lumber ships and the odd fishing trawler running contraband liquor up from the Maritimes, and he was good at his job in the way loud men sometimes are, fast, confident, usually right, which was part of why the town forgave him the rest of it. He had called Otto the junk man for going on 15 years, not out of real cruelty, just because it got a laugh, and it always did. $65, Vance said again, shaking his head at the men standing near him, one boot up on the running board of his own truck. For a cabinet that's been sitting in custom storage since before I had this job. The crowd laughed. Not because it was funny, because Vance laughed first, and a crowd does what the loud man does. Otto latched the tailgate and drove off without looking back. Now, if you have ever seen a man who knew exactly what he was doing get laughed out of a room by a man who did not, subscribe to this channel. Because the people who stay for stories like Otto Reyes's are exactly who abandoned government buildings discovery was built for. The customs house itself had gone up in 1938, brick and granite, built to inspect freight coming off the coastal steamers during the years when Port Ellsworth still had a working harbor. By the time the war came, half the building had been given over to evidence storage, seized goods, undeliverable freight, anything held for a hearing that never happened. Records at the county clerk's office, the kind Otto still knew how to read because his father had taught him to read a bill of lading before he taught him to read a book, showed the cabinet had come out of room 4, evidence hold, sealed in the spring of 1953. That spring, a merchant sailor named Thomas Idle had shipped out of Port Ellsworth on a freighter bound for Halifax, and before he left he had mailed a small package to the customs house for safekeeping, addressed to himself, to be held until his return. He never came back for it. His ship went down off Nova Scotia in November of that year, 12 men lost, and the package sat in room 4 because nobody filed the paperwork to release it, and nobody who could have filed it was left alive to ask. Idle had been 26, a deckhand working his way toward a mate's ticket, and 1953 was a year the whole coast still felt the war in its bones. Ration habits not yet broken. Half the men in town, missing a brother or a cousin from Korea, freighters running the same routes the Navy had used a decade before. Nobody came looking for the package because nobody left who knew to look. His mother had passed the year before. He had no brothers. Marion had waited, then stopped writing to the customs house after the 3rd, unanswered letter, because a woman can only knock on a government door so many times before she starts to believe the silence. 21 years. Otto did the arithmetic without meaning to. He had been 22 years old and just starting at his father's bench the spring that cabinet was sealed, still learning to read grain instead of fighting it. He thought about that on the drive home, the numbers running behind his eyes the way they always did with old work. How long a thing sits before somebody finally opens it, and how a building can hold a secret the way a person can, quiet and patient, waiting on nobody in particular. He backed the truck up to the shop at 4 that afternoon, 11 miles from the auction lot, driving 31 the whole way because the load rode uneven in the bed. Word had already beaten him home. Mrs. Talbot at the hardware store told him Vance had called it the worst $65 spent in county history, and Otto said nothing back, just bought the penetrating oil he'd come in for. 2 men helped him wrestle the cabinet into the workshop, 190 pounds of oak and brass by Otto's own guess. The 4 of them grunting it up 2 steps and through the door sideways. He set it under the single bare bulb hanging over his bench, turned the radio off the way he did for anything he wanted to hear properly, pulled his stool in close, and put his glasses on. The lock was old, a customs padlock stamped with a serial number, rusted through at the shackle, and it took him 20 minutes with a hacksaw just to clear it off the hasp. That wasn't a real door. The lock was for show. The real seam was the one at the back panel, the one that hadn't sat flush since the auction lot, and Otto knew a false front when he saw one. His father had taught him that on cabinets half this age. He worked oil into that seam first, packed a rag against it to hold the moisture there, and let it sit 20 minutes while he cleaned the rest of the cabinet down with a rag and warm water. The wood came up honey-colored under 40 years of grime, and it smelled of dust and something underneath the dust, faint, like a drawer that had never once been opened to air. His first attempt at the panel got him nothing. The wood had swollen into the frame and would not give an inch. He worked the oil in again, deeper this time, and made himself a cup of coffee while he waited, because he had learned a long time ago that wood does what it wants on its own schedule, not on a man's. The second attempt loosened one corner. He felt it shift under his palm, a give of maybe 1/8 of an inch, and for a moment his hand shook. Not from age, though the arthritis was always there, gnawing at both thumbs that night worse than usual from the cold, but from a small fear that comes right before a thing opens of what he might find and what he might not. He set the chisel down and sat with that for a minute, elbows on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. Then he picked the chisel back up. The third attempt was the one. He worked the blade along the seam, slow, no more than 1 inch at a time, and the panel came away with a sound so small he almost missed it. Not a crack, not a bang, just a soft give like a held breath let out. Cold air moved out past his face, dry and old, carrying the smell of paper gone brittle, and something underneath it, faint and sweet, like the inside of a cedar box. Otto did not reach in. He sat on his stool with his hands in his lap and looked into the dark space behind the panel for a long moment, the bare bulb throwing a weak yellow light that did not quite reach the back. His knees ached from crouching. His eyes were tired. He put his glasses up higher on his nose and looked again before he moved. He took the objects out one at a time and laid each one on the bench before reaching for the next, the way his father had taught him to inventory any sealed piece. Never grab, never rush, let the bench tell you the order. A folded bill of lading, brittle at the creases, the ink gone the color of rust. A small tin box holding $4 silver, dated 1948 through 1951, the metal cold in his palm. A Merchant Marine Service pin, the enamel chipped on one corner where it must have caught on something years before it ever reached that drawer. And last, wrapped in a handkerchief gone yellow with age, a small velvet box and a sealed envelope addressed in pencil. The writing still legible after 21 years in the dark. For Marion, to be opened when I'm home. Otto opened the velvet box first. Inside sat a wedding ring set, thin gold, the kind a young sailor could afford on a merchant marine's wage in 1953, the band worn smooth on the inside where it had never once been worn on a hand. He set it down gently, careful the way he was with any old joint, and opened the envelope. The letter ran 2 pages, a young man's plain handwriting, talking about the ship and the weather and how many weeks until Halifax and back. Near the bottom, one line stood apart from the rest, and Otto read it twice before he set the page down. I bought the ring in Portland, and I'm having the customs house hold it, so you won't find it snooping around the house. One more trip, and I'll put it on your hand myself. Otto folded the letter carefully along its original creases and sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the bench, the bulb overhead humming faintly, the shop otherwise silent. He did not cry. He wiped his palms on his trousers, the way he did after any close piece of work, and sat in the quiet listening to the radiator tick and the wind push at the window glass, close to a full minute, maybe more. He thought of his own wife, 22 years married that spring, and how a man plans for a life he does not always get to finish. Then he got up, made a fresh pot of coffee, and went back to cleaning the cabinet's hinges, because a man's hands need something to do after a thing like that. He drove to the county clerk's office the next morning at 8, having slept maybe 4 hours, and laid everything on the counter without a word. The ring, the letter, the coins, the pin. No ceremony, no speech. The clerk asked if he wanted his name listed for a reward, and Otto said no. That wasn't why he'd come, and left before she could argue the point. Word reached Roland Vance by that afternoon, and by evening the story had gone around every counter in Port Ellsworth, the same counters where he'd made his joke about $65 2 days before. Vance did not laugh this time. A man from the regional office called him about it directly, wanting to know how a sealed evidence cabinet had ended up sold at public auction in the first place, and Vance had no answer that made him look any better than the man he'd mocked. Within the year, the customs house closed its regional office entirely, folded into a district 40 miles north, and Vance took a desk job he never once talked about in town again. Nobody drove him out of anything. He just got quiet, and quiet was not a thing anyone had ever seen from him before. To his credit, when a reporter from the county paper asked him for a comment, he gave one plain line and nothing more. He'd been wrong about the man, and he said so. The clerk's office tracked down Marion Idle inside a week. She had never married. She was 82 years old, living 2 streets from the harbor in the same house she'd grown up in. Curtains still the same pattern her mother had sewn, and when they set the ring in her hand, she held it a long while before she said anything at all. She kept the letter folded in the same creases Otto had left it in a drawer by her bed, for the rest of her life, and she read it, her niece said later, most every Sunday. The cabinet itself sits today in the Penobscot County Historical Society, a small brass plaque beside it explaining what it once held and who brought it in. Children touch the wood on their way past and ask what a custom seal is, and their parents mostly don't know either, so they read the plaque out loud instead. Otto went back to shop the same day he delivered the ring. There was a chair leg waiting on his bench that needed re-gluing, and he got to it before lunch, same as any other Tuesday. A man laughed at him in a gravel lot for $65. And a woman who had waited 59 years finally stopped waiting. Both of those things happened because one man looked at a seam that didn't sit flush and decided it was worth his time to find out why. And another man learned, a little too late to matter, that being loud and being right are not always the same thing. What would you have done? Laughed along with the crowd, or looked twice at the thing nobody else was looking at?